Greetings, fellow learners. I hope you are doing well. It's week 9 now, so we've made our way to Margaret Cavendish. That's who we're discussing this week. Next week we move on to Leibniz, so we're just spending 1 week with Cavendish. Her dates are 1623 to 1673. Notice the overlap with Descartes' life. He died in 1650. I'll remind you again, right? So we're still roughly in the same time period, moving out of the Renaissance, going toward the Enlightenment, going toward contemporary science, right? Or certainly modern science. Okay, you will have noticed, I think, that Cavendish is English. Her work isn't translated for us. Maybe with the poems in particular, you noticed that they are originally in English and haven't been translated. Cavendish did not have the opportunity to receive a formal education, but as our editorial notes tell us, she benefited from intellectual engagement with her brother, John Lucas. It seems perhaps heartless, callous to say it, but it seems to me that Cavendish also benefited from her time in exile, right? That's something of a pattern for us. Locke had to go into exile. Princess Elizabeth was in exile. I mean, it looks like if you have money, then you might actually have some time on your hands if you go into exile. So I'm sure it was difficult for her. But she was exiled from England, and she seems to have written a lot while she was in exile. She was attached to Queen Henrietta Maria, and that queen went into exile as a result of the English Civil War. She was exiled in Paris, which is not a terrible place to be exiled, right? And that's where she met her husband, William Cavendish. So she and William Cavendish and her brother-in-law, Charles Cavendish, participated in a salon in Paris. It was called the Newcastle Circle, and a lot of distinguished guests were in and out of that particular salon, right? And I'm sure you've heard of a salon. In other words, it was an intellectual group that got together and discussed the topics of the day, and experimental philosophy was a hot topic of the day. Hobbes joined them for some discussions. His own philosophy was a hot topic of the day. You saw that Cavendish is responding to Hobbes's theory of perception in some of her writings, right? And Descartes joined them in the Newcastle Circle, and Cartesian philosophy was another hot topic, right? Okay, so she didn't get a formal education, but obviously she was around a lot of important ideas of the day, and she learned a lot in the ways that she was able to. She tried to engage other philosophers through correspondence, and that didn't go very well. It didn't go as well for her as it went for Princess Elizabeth. Perhaps that has something to do with the fact that Princess Elizabeth was royalty, but Cavendish wasn't. So you can see that people she tried to correspond with exhibited sexist attitudes toward her. They often didn't take her seriously. She was able to get published, though she struggled to get published. her work was good, and so she managed it, and she did have connections that helped her with some of her publications, right? Sometimes she has imaginary interlocutors, conversation partners in her works, right, which seems to indicate she was upset about not being able to engage others in philosophy as much as she wanted to. So that's a bit sad, but she did create these different points of view in her work, and so she was able to have something like a dialogue. She seems to have spent a lot of money trying to get her work into libraries. She donated to libraries, she donated money, and she donated some of her own books at the same time. You know, hint, hint, wink, wink. And that had some success, right? So her works got more circulation than they would have because she had money, but she was largely overlooked during her lifetime. But she's interesting, as we'll see, partly because she has her own take on the mind-body problem, even though she's not as directly engaged with Descartes as Locke and Spinoza. And obviously Princess Elizabeth was heavily engaged with Descartes. So she doesn't really mention Descartes so much in her own works, right? But you can see how her view has a strong bearing on the mind-body problem and does put forward a solution to it. Okay, not everything that we read is equally useful. I want to focus on the excerpts from her observations upon experimental philosophy. So I'm going to start with that rather than starting with what the editors put first. Okay, so starting on page 202 in the physical edition, but again, this is the beginning of our excerpts in the observations, so you can look for that, and I'm sure you can find what I'm referring to, even if you don't have the physical book. Starting on page 202, Cavendish divides matter into three portions, and these portions are not separable from each other. You can't separate them out from each other. They commingle, they coexist. But in any case, the three portions are the inanimate, right? Doesn't move, isn't alive as much as the other parts, right? I'm not sure. I don't think she wants to say there's any dead matter, but there's inanimate stuff, relatively unmoving, relatively unaware, right? But anyway, there's the inanimate, there's the sensitive, and there's the rational. The sensitive and the rational together are the animate part. So there's a bifurcation. We've got the animate and the inanimate, but then when you look at the animate, it divides into the sensitive and the rational. Okay. So what's going on there with these three portions of matter? So if we take a broad overview, it's clear that Cavendish is trying to address the mind-body problem, right? These rational and sensitive parts of matter can't be separated out from the inanimate parts, as I've said. So that makes Cavendish a panpsychist. So she's committed to panpsychism. That's the view that mind belongs to everything. Some degree of mind, some level of mind belongs to everything. So that's the view. There's a low-level consciousness of self throughout nature. I mean, that's my own word. I think I've said before, I know I said it in one of the lectures, consciousness is not a term that's used at this time. So she's not going to use that word, but that seems to be what she's saying, is that all of matter is consciousness. She uses self-knowledge instead, but what she seems to mean is there's a low-level consciousness everywhere. Everything is in motion, and it's at least aware of its own motion, right? And so that's the kind of consciousness that is everywhere throughout nature. Okay, so obviously then there's no mind-body gap if mind is just an aspect of matter, which is what she's saying. Right? These are aspects of matter. There's the inanimate, there's the sensitive, there's the rational, right? And I didn't say it yet, but sensitive means, perceiving, able to receive sensory impressions or something like that. And we'll talk about her model of perception by the end of this lecture. Okay, so let's quote from her now, pages 202 to 203 in the printed book, at least. So again, we're really at the beginning of Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. I'm reading from the second paragraph, near the end of the second paragraph. Okay, and here's what Cavendish says. Made a couple editorial insertions here. So the rational part in the framing of natural effects is, as it were, the surveyor or architect. The sensitive part is the laboring or working part. And the inanimate is the materials. And all these degrees of matter, these aspects, these parts of matter, are necessarily required in every composed action of nature. So there's the planner, someone with the plan. There's the laborer, someone who carries out the plan. And there are the materials, right? And again, the planner, that's the rational part of nature. The laborer, that's the sensitive part of nature. It's coordinating the parts, and so it's perceptive of them, right? So that's why she attributes perception to it. It has to be aware of the materials that it's working on, so it's sensitive or perceptive, and then there are the materials. There's some part of matter that just gets pushed around by the other parts and molded and formed. Okay. Notice she speaks of the composed action of nature. So it's Cavendish's view that we see ordered action everywhere throughout nature. Right. You've got the earth going around the sun. She didn't know about the movement of tectonic plates, but she knew about the results, earthquakes and movement of magma and lava erupting out of volcanoes, the motions of the tides, and then, of course, the motion of organic beings, plant growth and reproduction, animals moving on the surface of the earth. So the way that Cavendish sees it is, there's action everywhere. Everything is moving, everything's in motion. Okay, and so what does that tell us? It's her view that matter is basically alive, as I said, and in addition to having some kind of consciousness, it also is in motion, and I'll say more about that later. Right now, let me say that nature and matter are coextensive. There is no non-material part of nature, just to be clear, right? So, in case you're wondering, what kind of role a spirit plays in Cavendish's view, not really any role, right? So, as I said, I'm mostly looking at our observations, but then if we go a little backwards, if we look at her correspondence, if we look at letter 32 specifically, in which she's discussing Henry Moore, this will be on page 201, or in other words, just before the observations begin. Cavendish tells us that everything natural is material and everything material is natural. In her own words, that's what she says. So this is a closed system. It's closed to the non-natural and the non-material, which don't seem to have any purchase. They don't seem to have an entry point into the system, right? And in fact, she goes so far as to say, in her Grounds of Natural Philosophy, now this will be after the observations, pages 227 to 228, if you have the physical book, she goes so far as to say that angels are probably material. Now, why does she say that? Maybe that's an odd thing for her to say. She's thinking about God's punishments after the final judgment, right? And she's noting, this is something that Hobbes discusses in his Leviathan, by the way. She's noting that these punishments have to be material, right? Hobbes pointed out, if you look at the descriptions of hell, Hobbes has a long discussion about this. These are physical descriptions, right? So hell is this physical place, if it exists at all. And that's because we're material beings, and so our punishments have to be material, right? So Cavendish states that same view. She had interacted with Hobbes. I think she took it from Hobbes, but maybe it went the other way around. I wouldn't know for sure. So anyway, she just takes that point a little further and says, okay, well, the punishments are material, so we should expect those who execute the punishments to be material as well, right? And presumably God's angels will be involved in executing God's punishments, and so we would expect angels to be material as well. Perhaps not with the same definite kinds of bodies that we possess, right? Their bodies might be more malleable, right? So we're fixed in a certain form. If they're superior to us, perhaps they have the ability to change their physical forms to match whatever they're trying to do, right? We're stuck trying to use a body with these determinate boundaries to do these set number of things, and our body is more or less suited to these different things we're trying to do. Angels might be able to change their bodies so that the bodies are more suited to the tasks they're trying to carry out, so they could be really efficient at punishing, right? They could have bodies well suited for punishing, at least at the time that they're carrying out the punishments. Okay, that was a bit of a digression, but I did want to say the main point there was, matter is alive, and then there's nothing else, because matter and nature are the same. Nature is all of matter, right? And all of matter together is nature, and so that's all there is to talk about in experimental philosophy, right? Spiritual beings can't affect the natural world. Cavendish says we have these eternal, immortal souls that are a gift from God, but they don't do anything, which makes you wonder if she really believed that, or she was just trying to not get in trouble with the church. And I have no idea. I haven't read enough of her personal correspondence or looked into her personal life enough to have a view on that. But it's interesting. It does feed into our theme of secularization in this course. If you get to the point where immaterial souls become redundant and they don't do anything, I mean, the next logical step is just to throw them out and get rid of them, right? So that there is a sort of step towards secularization here. Okay. So let's come back to this point about ordered action. That's the primary point for us right now. Nature is generally ordered, right? And it is efficient to say that human thought and the order that spontaneously occurs in nature have the same source. And that's part of why she's saying there's a rational part of matter and it's not separable, and therefore reason is everywhere. Which is not the same as saying, conscious human thought and intention is everywhere. She's pretty clear in some of her works that different kinds of beings have different kinds of minds and thoughts, right? So we don't want to project too much and think that something like the human mind is everywhere. But again, everything's in motion and it's at least aware of its own motion, right? And different structures create different modes of motion, and so then we would expect different bodies that are structured differently to be capable of different kinds of thoughts, right? Okay, now if we take Cavendish's theory of matter a little bit farther, then we can see how her theory of perception works, which I think is inherently interesting. And it tells us more about the theory of matter in turn. So take the theory of matter farther, learn a little bit about perception, then we'll probably understand how she views matter a little better along the way. Okay, so it's a win-win situation. All right, so looking at the observations upon experimental philosophy again, as we've mentioned, we see that all matter has self-motion and self-knowledge. This is clear from page 208, among other places. So let me see if I could help those without the physical book. They have the electronic copy instead. Page 208 in the physical book is a full page that comes just before chapter 3 on micrography, or in other words, microscopes. So if you're looking for my page 208, look just before chapter 3, the bit about microscopes. Okay, so everything's in motion, everything's got self-knowledge. It's true that there's an inanimate portion of matter, but remember the figure of the person being dragged along by the horse, right? Cavendish conjectures that the inanimate part of matter is dragged along by the animate part. Dragged along is loose, but it'll become more clear as we keep going. So I'll try to remember to come back to it. Okay, so all's in motion. The rational part is ordering the motion toward definite ends. There's a plan because of the rational part, right? So it's not random motion. what kinds of motion are there? Well, eventually we get into a distinction between internal motion and external motion, or internally caused motion. She doesn't always spell it out that way. Internally caused versus externally caused. The internally caused motion she calls voluntary. So, anyway, examples. You'll want examples. So, there's a wolf chasing a rabbit, say, right? The wolf's motion is ordered by its sensitivity and its rationality. The rabbit's motion is also so ordered, right? There, I mentioned the Earth going around the sun. That's just as good an example from her point of view, right? It's there's a plan. There's some good effect that's achieved by the Earth going around the sun, and so it's rational, right? And I don't know how much sensitivity she wants to attribute to either body, but I can tell you that parts of the Earth move together. Again, she doesn't know about tectonic plates, but she knows about some of the effects of tectonic plates. The Earth is a moving body. The sun is a moving body, right? There's sensitivity there because there are different parts moving together, and maybe it's less, or maybe it's just different from the sensitivity of organic bodies. Okay. So, moving toward perception, think about digestion. That's an ordered action. That is to say, there are definite things that have to happen in your body for digestion to occur. And what's really important for understanding Cavendish is that digestion involves the coordination of different parts of the body, like the stomach and the intestines, for instance. Not just those, but I'm just naming different parts. Stomach does one thing, intestines do another thing, right? These parts have to be sensitive to each other. There's some perception going on there. They exhibit sympathy, which is not a word she uses, but I like to use it in connection with her. They exhibit sympathy, they coordinate, they cooperate, right? So they're sensitive to each other, so there's some perceiving going on. But this is all part of a larger pattern of expulsion, right? We have digestion because things that are useless to us need to be expelled from the body. So looking at digestion, we get the three parts of matter. We understand there's material there. From her point of view, the different parts are sensitive to each other, and that's how they're collaborating. And there's clearly a rational ordering and a rational plan. So this she would call an internal action, a voluntary action. Voluntary just means internal for her, as far as I can make out. Okay, so the way Cavendish sees it is, when you have a complicated process like digestion or the growth of a tree, or if she were around now, she would say the fusion that the sun undergoes and the release of energy as a result of that fusion, just to pick an interesting example that she would like if she were here. You take these processes, they involve the coordination of diverse parts, right? And so again, there has to be sensitivity going on there, and I'm giving you examples in which there's a plan, right? Because the tree is growing because it's going to become a mature human tree, and digestion is happening because stuff needs to be expelled from the body. And the sun is this big fusion generator because, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, as a human, hey, we need light and warmth. You know, there seems to be a plan. Many people have noted. Obviously, there's a secular way of looking at all this, but gosh, it does work out well. That hey, there's a big light heat generator, and up in the sky, and here are a bunch of organic beings on the surface of this dirt ball that need heat and light to do what they do. So that actually does work out really well. Right. Even more generally speaking, what we normally think of as discrete objects are sort of held together by these ordered internal motions, right? Cavendish appreciated that, you know, you look at a stone and it looks like it's just sitting there, but there are internal forces and pressures at work. You know, we would say at the atomic and the subatomic level, you know, obviously she doesn't have an electron microscope or anything, but that's her view of the world, that there are these dynamic forces at work and they can sort of coalesce together in such a way, and they can be ordered in such a way that you end up with what appears to be a stable object, but at the same time, everything really at a deep level is in motion and alive and aware of itself. Okay, so as for perception, I said we were going to understand perception. So this is a matter of the internal movement in a suitably structured organ patterning itself according to the movement outside of it, right? So everything has its own peculiar motion. As I've said, everything has internal motion. So sometimes you get something like an eyeball, that's according to a rational plan, or you get something like an inner ear, right? And it's structured in such a way that its internal motion is constantly duplicating some external motion out there. And that's what perception is. It's a sympathy again. And again, I don't see her use that word. I just think it works really well for what she's saying. The inner motions of the eye move in sympathy with the motions outside of it, and the inner motions of the inner ear move in sympathy with what's going on outside the inner ear. There's no entry into the sensitive organ from her point of view. That is to say, nothing enters the eye and nothing enters the inner ear, nor are external things putting pressure on the eye or the ear or the skin. That sounds odd to us, but that's her view. Perception isn't created by pressure. That's not how it works. How it always works with perception is you have the right kind of structure so that internal motion mimics external motion. It is her general view, and this is stated on page 204, okay, on the physical book, which puts us where the third page of the observations, if you have the ebook. Just go to the third page of the observations, whatever number that is for you. So she says clearly on page 204, and this isn't the only place she says it, but she says motion can't be transmitted. It's a weird view. It's not the weirdest view we've looked at, but that's her view. Motion is not transmitted. So when we talk about the animate part of matter dragging the inanimate part along, we're not talking about motion being transmitted because she doesn't think that's possible. she doesn't think in general that a property of one body could be transmitted to another body, right? Because everything, what it comes down to for her, and this isn't clear in what we read probably, but it's clear elsewhere in her corpus, everything is matter, and so if properties could move, one body would get bigger and one body would get smaller. I mean, that really is her view, right? If matter could be transmitted, then the body transmitting, sorry, if motion could be transmitted, I apologize, if motion could be transmitted, then the body transmitting the motion would get smaller and the body receiving the motion would get bigger, because you can't transmit the property of a body without transmitting some of the body. That's the view, right? So it's worth noting that this is anti-Newtonian, but Newton hasn't done his important work yet. So she's not arguing with Newton. She just has a view that is at its core anti-Newtonian. Motion cannot be transmitted from one body to another because of her general view that bodies don't transmit things to each other. And I'm pointing this out because you have to understand how perception works, I think, to fully understand her notion of matter. And so you do need to realize that perception isn't a matter of anything being transmitted to anything else, which you would think it is, but that's just not her view. Her view is, to give you a really straightforward example, you look up at the sun in the sky. This is not a matter of photons leaving the sun and then going into your retina. I don't know how she would reinterpret the data we have now if she were here. But in any case, that doesn't work for her. What she thinks is going on is, okay, the sun is out there 93 million miles away or whatever it is, and there is no vacuum. There is no vacuum of space. She sees space as a plenum. There's always some matter there, and there's no gap in matter. That's what plenum means here, right? So the sun is causing the matter next to it to pattern, to reproduce an image of the sun, which causes the matter next to it to reproduce an image of the sun. And this keeps happening up until the point that it gets to your eyeball, right? So somehow there's a suitable medium between you and the sun, right? Because not every body transmits every image, but there is a suitable medium. It just so happens, right? So the sun does its thing, and it gets patterned in space, and then in the atmosphere, and then it patterns in your eye because it's being patterned right outside your eye by the medium that exists. Okay, and so by the time we get through the theory of perception, I do think we understand better how matter works. More self-contained than you would have thought. That seems important, right? But what's contained where depends on the rational ordering, the rational structure, and the kinds of movements you get. They happen according to that rational plan, but they also happen because there's a sensitivity, right? Or some kind of low-level perception that enables the different parts of a single body to coordinate with each other. Okay, well, I hope that was interesting. I enjoyed talking about it. I haven't talked much at all. You can tell I barely use my mouth. I haven't talked much about Cavendish over the years, so it's interesting to do a little lecture on her. Thank you.